6 years ago, we first saw the iconic interview between Jordan Peterson
No, I'm not saying that at all.
and Cathy Newman.
I'm just trying to work that out. I mean,
Since then, this video has been watched over 47 million times. It has turned into a landmark conversation with countless reaction videos, such as this one. But what's different about today is by the end of this video, you'll be able to understand the communication tips and tactics that Jordan Peterson used to turn an interview that was like this.
you're saying that women aren't intelligent enough to run these top companies?
No, I didn't say that at all.
Into an interview like this.
Ha, gotcha.
You have got me. I'm trying to work
about
that through in
time.
my head. Yeah, it took a while.
It did, yeah.
Took a while.
Let's hop into it. Let me quickly say that this interview is not my personal content, so I will be sharing short clips starting from the first second and going to the end of the conversation. If you'd like to watch the conversation in full, you can do it at Channel 4 News YouTube channel. I'll put the link below. In addition, I want us to understand Jordan Peterson as a communicator in general. So I've included moments from other interviews, and those links are in the description. Let's see how they start. Real quick, if you haven't met me, my name's Chris Miller. I started my career as a public speaking teacher. I studied presidential rhetoric in graduate school, and I worked with a couple different tech companies. I'm fascinated by how leaders and individuals communicate, and I think there's so many conversations that we can listen to, but we should also be learning from. This whole YouTube channel is looking at big conversations so that we can take out little things that impact our lives and our ability to communicate with those around us. I'd love for you to subscribe. Let's get back to the video.
Jordan Peterson, you've said that men need to, quote, grow the hell up. Tell me why.
Well, because there's nothing uglier than an old infant. There's nothing good about it. People who don't grow up don't.
I want to quickly stop here for us to assess what's the rhetorical setting, where is this happening, and what's all going on. As we can see, Jordan B. Peterson, he's an author, he's written the book 12 Rules for Life, he's a clinical psychologist, but this interview, the very first second, isn't used for pleasantries. It's not, hey, thanks for being here, or thanks for having me on. Neither side. So the very first question and the very first second is a hard-hitting one. You've said that men need to grow the hell up. Tell me why. And I also want to skip maybe a minute forward because I want to see what the studio looks like.
Your audience is a male,
Well, it's
right?
about 80% on YouTube, which is
This is interesting to me because from the jump, I automatically think about what the studio is set up for. In this frame, you can't even see Cathy Newman, so there's a decent amount of distance.
YouTube is a male domain
Even then,
primarily, so it's hard to tell how much of it is because YouTube is male.
so now once you can actually see Cathy Newman, the angle has changed a bit, so the distance looks a little different. But we think about this, the use of space and how it affects communication as proxemics. So very quickly, there are different levels of social space. For instance, the very inner core is our intimate space, and this is anywhere from 0 inches to 18 inches. So these are our loved ones, they're our close confidants. Then we have our personal space, and that goes to about 3.5 feet. And we have our social space, this goes to about 8 feet out. Then we have our public space. Now, the different levels of space affect what we say and how we say them differently. So if you're all the way out here, 12 feet, versus you being very near to me, I'm more likely to speak with a raised voice. That way I can make sure you hear it. But if I'm sitting quite closely to you and I'm speaking with a raised voice, there's something off. And this studio, in my head, is almost set up to raise your voice because you're sitting kind of far. And another implication of that is if you are raising your voice, it may be more difficult to listen. So it's almost like going back and forth. And we can compare this to another viral interview that Jordan Peterson did with GQ. Let's look at this interview.
So if you're going to play neurochemistry, let's go and do it.
Okay, well, you say antidepressants work on lobsters.
Yes, they do.
Okay. So not even thinking about the context here or the content here. Let's look at the spacing. If one of them were to sit differently, then they would touch their legs. So they are very close here. And in this moment, we can see a bit of a back and forth. But my hunch from the jump is that sitting like this is going to result in a different conversation than sitting like this.
How much of it is because of what I'm saying? But
They're quite far away in that. I also want to point out Jordan Peterson's nonverbal, his frame that he's setting here, despite them being quite far apart, rather than leaning in, which most people would expect if you're kind of far apart, he's leaning back, hands together. He's a psychologist by trade, so it makes you wonder if that's just a position that he's comfortable with. But whenever you see this, you think of listening. You think of a conversation where each word matters and you want to get through them. After the fact, I was able to do a little research about this conversation, and he went on the Joe Rogan podcast, and Joe Rogan asked him a question about this conversation, and here's what he says.
I met her in the green room beforehand. She was being made up, and then they put a little bit of powder on me, and we had a friendly kind of interchange, and then we went and sat in front of the cameras and for a couple of minutes, before the show got rolling, and we had a pretty pleasant back and forth. And then as soon as the cameras went on, she was a completely different person. Oh. And I thought, oh, I see.
With this added context, we can better understand the body language. We can understand why, rather than trying to lean in and make it seem like more of a close conversation to close some of this gap, he's actually leaning back because he feels like there's something up and he wants to be able to better understand each word. Now, our body posture and the way that we use it affects the way we communicate. This is one of my favorite TED Talks ever, is Amy Cuddy. It's received over 24 million views. It's the second most popular TED Talk. But this is what she studies, is how your body language affects how you think. Here's a little bit of it.
When we think of nonverbals, we think of how we judge others, how they judge us, and what the outcomes are. We tend to forget, though, the other audience that's influenced by our nonverbals, and that's ourselves. We are also influenced by our nonverbals, our thoughts and our feelings and our physiology.
The message there is how we sit and how we place ourselves will affect the way we think. Whenever I go back to the conversation, look at the difference in body posture here. We can see Cathy Newman, who's leaning in, and then Jordan Peterson, who's leaning back. There's different things being communicated. Leaning back to me communicates listening, while leaning forward communicates interest, typically, but it also is looking for an opening. Let's go further in to see what that opening may be. Now, once we go 2 minutes further into the video, at the 3-minute mark, we start to see an interesting trend. There's a certain phrase that if you've seen the video, I'm sure that you've seen, but I'll show you a couple examples.
Why in the world would you not want a competent partner? Well, I know why, actually. You can't dominate a competent partner. So if you want domination...
to dominate, is that...
So he says one thing, and then she says, so you're saying, and another thing. Let's look at another example.
Get down by occupation. We break it down by interest. We break it down by personality.
But you're saying basically it doesn't matter if women aren't getting to the top, because that's what's skewing that gender pay gap, isn't it? You're saying, well, that's just a fact of
no,
fact. Women aren't necessarily going to get to the top.
No, I'm not saying it doesn't matter either.
You're saying,
there are multiple reasons.
Okay, so that was 3 times in about 15 seconds, and we're still at the 6-minute mark. This phrase you're saying is a really interesting way to be able to paraphrase. I love the idea of paraphrasing, being able to be like, hey, just to make sure we're on the same page, I'll show you why, is the communication model typically looks at a sender and a receiver. Now, in order to communicate, we need to be able to get a message from the sender to the receiver. So the message goes from the sender to the receiver, but in between the sender and the receiver is the channel. And this channel is what we have to go beyond to be able to get the message over. So for instance, if I'm saying a certain thing, it may be a complex topic. In order for me to get it there, I have to make sure nothing interrupts it in this channel, and we call that noise. Now, noise may be physical noise, such as there's someone with a power tool next to you. and you can't hear. So I'm like, hey, I need you to repeat it, or maybe you hear part of it. Like, think of the telephone game, right? The message changes because of so much overlap. The noise could also be psychological. So potentially you may have just gotten dumped and you're feeling really down. You're feeling very sad. So whenever someone tells you something, you hear it differently compared to maybe you just got a promotion and your head's in the clouds and you're thinking about how this new paycheck is going to affect your family's budget. So maybe saying something to you is going to be interpreted a different way. Well, whenever a message gets sent, feedback goes back, and the sender will encode a message right here. The receiver decodes the message over here. That's what they have. The receiver then encodes feedback, and then the sender decodes the feedback. And this right here is conversational turn taking. You get the circular motion of conversation. But there are moments where the noise is so loud that I think it's good to be able to say, hey, just to make sure we're on the same page, is this what you said? From the jump, I initially thought that's what Cathy Newman was doing. So you're saying this, so you're saying that. But this phrase was actually used 35 different times throughout this conversation. And as you saw, we'll look quickly again.
It down by occupation. We break it down by interest. We break it down by personality.
But you're saying basically it doesn't matter if women aren't getting to the top, because that's what's skewing that gender pay gap, isn't it? You're saying, well, that's just a fact
No, I'm
that
saying
women
it
aren't
doesn't
necessarily
matter.
going to get to the top.
No, I'm not saying it doesn't matter either.
Just
Jordan Peterson, after she says, so you're saying this, he says, no, I'm not saying that. And I would understand like 1, 2, 3, 4 times, potentially trying to complete the other person's sentences to like have some good synergy. But after 35 times, and after the first few times, the other person says, no, I wasn't actually saying it, then I would expect someone to change their communication style, because it's like, okay, we're clearly not on the same page. There's some noise in this communication that is affecting us, so I'm going to sit back and listen more rather than trying to complete the sentences. Now, on Cathy Newman's side, she is an interviewer. It can be hard to interview people. It can be really tough, especially whenever you have a general mission before the interview starts, and maybe you've heard certain things about an individual. She was even asked about this, so here's her response.
The studio, we had a pretty robust exchange of views. You know, that's the name of the game, really.
Curious at the time, were you aware of how often you used the phrase, so you're saying?
Of course not. I mean, the whole point about the interview was that it was going to be cut down to a kind of 3-minute, 4-minute studio piece.
She says, no, I wasn't aware of that, which is fair. That can happen. But then she says, the whole point was it was going to be cut down to a 3 or 4 minute piece. So with that being said, what that communicates is she's hunting for sound bites. And this is a lot of journalism, right? Other than the long form podcasting or talking to the camera, talking head videos on YouTube. Oftentimes it's hunting for sound bites. But when we're hunting for sound bites, we may not be able to listen as well as we could if we were actually trying to understand the other side or trying to find harmony. Now, the so you're saying, it really blew up. It was interesting, though, whenever Jordan Peterson went on the Joe Rogan Experience. You can watch that YouTube video on full. Look at how Joe started the conversation between the two of them.
The Joe Rogan Experience.
Boom, and we're live. 12 rules for life. So without reading this, so what you're saying is, that's what I'm like,
There's only 12 things you need to know in life, right? That's it?
yeah.
Even on the Joe Rogan Experience, you see Joe Rogan saying, so what you're saying is. And I don't want to like beat this into oblivion, because I know that if you go on YouTube, there's a lot of reaction videos about this. But I do think it's interesting whenever you look at the communication model and you look at sender to receiver, paraphrasing, making sure you're on the same page is important. But when you're doing it with the intent on trying to get them, you're essentially decoding a message that they didn't actually encode, they didn't actually send. Then it can get messy and not lead to harmony. The last thing that I found most interesting, even more than the 35 so you're sayings or Jordan Peterson's use of his frame or the way that the studio was set up, was this idea of personalization and rather than discussing topics at a big conceptual level, being able to discuss them personally and putting the other person into the conversation, because it changes the way we view things. I'll show you an example.
For the top, but you're going to put all those hurdles in their way, as has been in their way for centuries, and that's fine. You're saying that's fine.
No, I really
The
think
patriarchal system
really
is just
that's
fine.
silly. I do. I think that's silly. I really do. I mean, look at your situation. You're hardly unsuccessful.
Yeah, and I have battled quite hard to get where I've got to.
Good
So
for
that's
you.
okay.
So this is important to note. They're talking about the gender pay gap. They're talking about women in the workforce, men in the workforce. But rather than argue back, Jordan Peterson says, hey, look at your situation. And then Cathy Newman says, you know what? You're right. I have worked hard. And then which Jordan Peterson says, exactly, that's my point. So putting the person in the conversation is different. It's like giving someone relationship advice, but then you trying to take relationship advice. It's different. But if we can do that in tough conversations and actually make it real, then it changes the way things work. Let me show you another example.
Okay, you cited freedom of speech in that. Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. You know, like you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable.
Well, I'm very glad I put you on the spot.
Well,
I'm very glad that I have
but you get my point. You get my point. It's like you're doing what you should do, which is digging a bit to see what the hell's going on.
So
and that is what you should do. But you're exercising your freedom of speech to certainly risk offending me. And that's fine. I think more power to you as far as I'm concerned.
So you haven't sat there and I'm just trying to work that out. I mean,
Gotcha.
You have got me. I'm trying to work that.
This is the harmony moment of this whole entire interview. It is the tension's been building up, the paraphrasing, potentially putting words in each other's mouths, and then getting to a point to where finally they see eye to eye. And
to my head.
As you can see, that's the first genuine smile that we've seen from Cathy Newman throughout this whole interview. The reason this happened, though, was because Jordan Peterson was able to say, hey, let's look at this current moment. Throughout the interview, he had examples and he had stories, but by saying, let's look at this current moment, it's almost irrefutable. Sure, you can deny and say, I think you're reading this differently. But as you can see with that smile, there was breakthrough. And this is what was so brilliant about this interview is tension builds up for harmony. And in conversation, we want harmony. And it's hard to find harmony with the other person when you're trying to get them to say a certain thing. For instance, shopping for sound bites, or maybe for Jordan's side, if he were just talking about his book. Like, yes, this relates to my book, or this is about my book, go buy my book. That's not actually an intention to find harmony. Now, with that being said, I can't paint this as being happily ever after. For instance, what happens after the smile?
You're saying that trans activists could lead to the deaths of millions of people.
I'm saying that the philosophy...
Same thing. So you're saying, no, this is what I'm saying. And it almost looked like it was going to come to a harmonious point and they were going to leave. But as you can see, the very end of this interaction.
People that I've targeted miserable.
Jordan Peterson, thank you.
My pleasure. Nice talking with you.
Cathy Newman finally says, Jordan Peterson, thank you. And he has a little chuckle and he says, my pleasure, nice talking to you. That was the first semblance of any pleasantries throughout this whole interaction. It wasn't at the beginning, it was at the end. And it makes you wonder, like, had the setting been different and had they set everything up with their pleasantries a bit differently, I wonder if the conversation would have gone differently. I think that there were clear intentions on either side. One side more than the other just due to the idea of sound bites, like trying to go after sound bites really affects the conversation. If you found this interesting, you may also find the last conversation I analyzed, which was Putin and Tucker, and how two different cultures coming together for a landmark conversation, starting from minute 1 and going to the end of that conversation. If you have anything you'd like me to analyze, check it out in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe. I'm working on a new video about an upcoming conversation that I think you're going to find very interesting. Subscribe, you'll be the first to see it. But other than that, as always, I'll see you next time.